All right, we're live. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in to Let's Talk Lake County. I'm your host, David Rich. I have a recurring guest on my other show, the Illinois Green Party series, which I don't do anymore. Sid Smith. Sid Smith is a former professor of mathematics at Virginia Tech, and he is also the creator and host of a, I would say, lecture/video series, How to Enjoy the End of the World. Hello, Mr. Smith. How are you, sir?
I'm good, thanks. Just a small correction. I was not a professor at VT. I just gave a talk there. But I was a college math teacher at Radford and at Hampton-Sydney and a handful of other places.
Okay, great. Sorry, I apologize. Okay, good. You have just a wealth of information, and obviously interviewing you probably 4 times on the Green Party series, if definitely at least 3. I think 4. You were the most popular guest. The viewership for your shows was greater than anybody else, easily, individually and collectively. It's always fascinating talking to you because you definitely do your homework, and having a PhD in mathematics is helpful for doing the proper analysis and the gathering of data and the critical thinking skills and inferring the proper meaning and not just making up stuff. So that's really it's refreshing just talking to you about these things. So I want to start with 2024 being the hottest year on record. We hit the 1.5 degree global average temperature, which is the degree that we were trying to avoid getting. Well, I shouldn't say trying, that we were told
supposed to avoid it, yeah.
Well, it's supposed to avoid, right? There wasn't a whole lot of effort there, obviously. No, I mean, some scientists are saying, like, hold on, it's just 1 year. Slow down. You need to. It hasn't been an established pattern yet, which is true. But it's also disconcerting because we shouldn't be there, and we are. So, what do you speak to that?
Well, a couple of notes. First of all, some scientists I was just reading earlier, reputable people in the modeling field, I think it was about 1.6 actually this past year, a little higher than 1.6. And additionally, as to a pattern, if you look at how things have been going the last few years, there's a pretty clear pattern actually. It's looking a lot like a little bit of an exponential curve upward. The BBC had a nice image. I probably can't share anything with you here, but there was a nice image, beautiful data representation that showed how the spread of temperature distribution by year has been going, and it was pretty steady for a long time up until about 1980, and then it started to edge up in a sort of a linear fashion. But since 2000, especially since 2005, it's looking more and more like a trajectory with positive curvature. So not only is the temperature increasing, but the rate at which the temperature is increasing is also increasing. So it has a positive derivative, as we say in the math world. So that's very concerning, actually, because as a number of people have pointed out, including a number of good scientists have pointed out, we're outside all the models. All the models they made, the IPCC and all those people, all the models of how this could play out under different scenarios, none of them match what we're seeing. What we're seeing is worse, which means we're in totally uncharted territory. Nobody can say with any degree of authority what to expect at this point. So, one hopes that the optimists are right and this is a fluctuation and that we'll return to something the models have been telling us about. But we don't really have any reason to feel very confident that that's the case. We're all sort of in a wait and see mode. But the worst possibilities are pretty bad.
Oh, yeah, no, that'd be it. In the spectrum of possible outcomes, you start getting towards the right side there. It's some pretty bad scenarios. And it's also like the uncertainty of when it could happen too. I mean, I'm reading a book right now. It's about the history of climate change, and it's basically going through when we first started noticing all the scientists chiming in, not all, but a lot of the scientists chiming in. Tyndall, I think his name was, in like the mid 1800s, who actually figured out that carbon dioxide molecules absorb infrared heat and retain them and that kind of thing, which is the underpinning of all that's going on here as far as carbon dioxide goes, and water vapors too. As carbon dioxide molecules and water vapors absorb and retain heat. So you start dumping that stuff into the atmosphere, and well, the temperature is going to go up. I mean, that's just kind of basic logic. The established pattern of it being, or that it's only a year long, is maintains a slight degree of hope. But like you said, the uncertainty is can be mind boggling and rather oppressive intellectually, because you start.
Well, the pattern for the last few years is a real pattern. I mean, it's not just random all over the place. It's a steady rate of increase that is itself increasing. So I think, to say that there's no pattern is probably a little bit misleading. But on the other hand, and I feel some vindication about this because it's a point I made very much in my videos, especially the one on complexity. The climate is a perfect example of a mathematically complex system. It exhibits mathematical chaos, which means you can't build a model that is going to reliably tell you what's going to happen. Any model you build is going to be, a fair guess, a projection. But like the weather, beyond a certain point, it simply becomes impossible to say what's going to occur. The weather report's pretty reliable for tomorrow. Depending on where you are and how good your weather reports are. It's moderately reliable for a week from now. They simply don't even bother about 3 weeks from now because it's impossible. Because it's a chaotic system and no model is going to tell you how it will evolve through time past a certain point. And the climate's the same way. So we're kind of seeing something now.
It's interesting to bring that up because actually I was just reading that part of that book I just mentioned today about complexity of nature in general, but like global climate change. I mean, it's it gets more complex than that. He gave like this analogy of like throwing like letting a basketball like off a mountaintop, and like with all the different variables of like the wind speed and the wind friction, and plus like the divots, the spikes, the rocks, and everything else. You have absolutely no way of predicting how that basketball is going to roll down that path. It's just not possible. It could go to the right, it could go to the left, it could go up, it could get stuck. Like every possible scenario is present before you actually do it. And that's a tough one. But what do you think about the complexity, the uncertainty of predictability of all this, and how should that tie into like our concern about climate change? Do you think that should alleviate some of the concern? Because like, sorry, epistemically, I just can't get there to like, believe
that. It shouldn't relieve any anxiety about what we're doing because while we can't predict what's going to happen, we do know that there's going to be a lot more heat in the atmosphere and in the oceans, and that's going to have consequences. The fact that we can't predict those consequences in detail doesn't negate the fact that it inevitably has consequences and serious ones. A point I also like to make is that time is a factor here. People don't tend to think about the time as a factor in these equations, but one of the analogies I often give is if I jump off a chair.
He froze up a bit there. He's frozen. Give him a second to notice and fix.
We back?
Yeah, I'm here.
I have to remind people that I live in the sticks, so my internet sometimes kind of comes and goes. Anyway, so to go back to where I was, time is a factor, and people often don't give enough weight to that fact. So here's an analogy. If I jump off a chair onto the floor, I'm probably not going to hurt myself. But if I jump off my house onto the ground, there's a good chance I'll hurt myself. And if I jump off a 5-story building onto the ground, they're going to be scraping me up and carrying me to the morgue. And what's the difference between all those things? I'm impacting the same surface in each case, but it's how fast I'm impacting it, right? As they like to say, it's not the fall that kills you, it's the sudden stop at the end. And how suddenly that stop occurs, right? How violent that stoppage occurs is what causes all the damage. Now, temperature of the planet has fluctuated wildly over the last hundreds of millions of years. In fact, for most of its history, the planet was much warmer than it is now and teeming with life. So being warm isn't the problem. The problem is how fast it happens.
Right.
Typically, temperature rises like this take thousands and thousands of years, if not longer, to occur. And in those rare cases we see in the paleo and geological record where it happened faster, those were mass extinctions, right? Because the biosphere can only respond so fast to changes in the environment, and if those changes occur too abruptly, then it can't respond quickly enough, and you get mass extinctions. So that's kind of the issue. It's yes, we're making the planet warmer, a lot warmer, and we're doing it in the blink of an eye in geological terms, which means that the destructive impact of that change is at least comparable to the meteor that killed the dinosaurs.
Wow.
That's the degree of violence being done to the Earth system. And we don't think about that because we're so ephemeral, right? To us, a few years is a long time. To the Earth, it's nothing. It's a blink.
Right.
So from the point of view of the Earth, what's being done to it is kind of like an explosion. In fact, it is an explosion. It's the setting off of an enormous conflagration. And while we can't say, well, this is exactly what's going to happen on human timelines, we can say that it's going to be enormously violent to the Earth as a whole. Now, the Earth will survive, go a few million years into the future, and it will be green and teeming with life and evolving all kinds of marvelous new creatures that we wish we could see. But we won't, because we won't be there.
Right.
Right.
Well, unless man adapts and builds some sort of architectural structures where they can live in and never go outside, or something sci-fi spacey like that, underground bunkers or something where you alternate. What are those? What is that from that H.G. Wells time machine? The Morlocks. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about.
Oh, right. Yes.
Stuff like that.
But see, all of those things tend to make us think we can somehow powerfully imagine ourselves into the future, but we really don't have a way of relating to the expanses of time that are involved. Right? There's no way to take that kind of time and relate it to human experience.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, it's reminding me of the LA. No, I'm still here. You're good. I mean, you're still here. I hear you. The LA fires right now, I mean, it just is a good example, an illustration of if it gets too intense, there's really nothing you can do. You just gotta kind of probably the best course of action is just to kind of let it happen and let it burn itself out. There's no way, I don't think, that human beings at this juncture in our evolution can actually be able to technologically prevent the travesties that are coming with the global temperature
to a great extent. I mean, no matter what we do, enough damage has already been done that it will take millions of years for the Earth to recover.
Right.
That's something that's already happened. How much more damage will happen is impossible to know. I think there's some reason for optimism that we probably aren't going to be capable of doing a great deal more damage, but that doesn't mitigate the damage we've already done.
Do you think we're past the critical point?
Well, I'm not sure what you refer to as critical point.
Point of no return. How's that?
Well, I think we've already done enough damage that it's going to be a very rough ride for human beings here forward for quite a long time. Although I think, in saying that, it's important to remember that that won't be the first time. Right? We tend to be deceived by how easy life has been these last few centuries. Usually it's not. Right? Human beings have been through a lot of bottlenecks. We've almost gone extinct a number of times. And we're probably going to do so. And at one point, we will go extinct. You just can't know when that is. But in the meantime, we've lost our congenial climate. From a human point of view, is effectively permanently. So that's a thing we're going to have to live with going forward.
Yeah, no, it'll be, to say the least, interesting to see how we deal with it. Excuse me. All right. So, any comments, concerns about the up and coming administration that's coming in and concerning climate change and the environment? Because I mean, I know that Trump thinks that climate change is a hoax. Now we still have the EPA and all these other God.
His followers think it's a hoax, and he plays up to that. What
Okay.
Trump thinks is, who knows?
No, nobody knows.
I mean, Trump's whole career is based on spewing whatever bullshit is needed right at the moment. So he's kind of the quintessential politician. No wonder he's so successful, right? What he actually thinks, I mean, and the answer to that's probably not much. But as to his effect with respect to climate change, I know he's all about the drill, baby, drill, and he's certainly has a lot of pro-petroleum folks coming into his administration. But they're running up against some very hard realities. We hit peak conventional oil nearly 20 years ago in 2005. We hit peak petroleum from all sources in November of 2018. We've been on a rough plateau since then, but we've never gotten back to the level of production globally that we had 6 years ago, a little over 6 years ago now. There's a lot of political hay made out of, should we drill here? Should we drill there? But the fact is, it has to make economic sense to drill or it won't happen. And the reason that oil production peaked and has been on a plateau is it makes less and less economic sense from a capitalist point of view to do all that drilling, because you have to invest more than you get out of it. So you can't make any money doing it. And the consequence is going to be, because the cost of extracting energy has gotten to be such a large proportion of the energy extracted, that it can no longer be sustained in a capitalist economic model. But nobody else knows, nobody knows what other kind of model will work other than nationalizing energy production and governments limping along as best they can over time. And I think we'll see more and more of it. We saw it in Germany, for example, with respect to their natural gas company and their electric company. They had to nationalize it because it could no longer survive on a standard for-profit economic model. And I think we're going to see that all over the world. I think it'll even come to the United States eventually, because you just won't be able to get the energy that you need on a profitable basis because it costs too much to get the energy. We have to continue to extract and refine oil just to feed ourselves. And so it's going to continue, but it can't grow. It can only decline. And I think for that reason, we've presently extracted about half the available fossil fuel that the planet has to give us, as far as we know. And most of that's going to stay in the ground because it's too hard for us to get at it. Yeah. So that's a reason for optimism. Right? Not if you're an investor, but it's a reason for optimism if you like the planet and want to do as little damage to it as possible. Because we can't stop ourselves. Right? We don't have the political will. We don't have the capacity, politically or socially, to stop ourselves from using that energy. But fortunately, the laws of economics, the iron laws of economics, are going to do it for us. It just won't be possible to do anymore.
Right. Probably not optimistic to free market capitalists, but yeah. Right. I said it's probably not optimistic to a free market capitalist. The nationalizing industry, no, they don't. They tend to not like that. I tend to not like it, but I mean, if it needs to happen, it needs to happen. Well, there's a senator, I think, Kennedy, but he's the really obnoxious one, Mount East, who even suggested that the federal government create a nationalized flood insurance department.
Well, they're going to have to.
Because certain companies are buckling. They can't do it. There's just too much.
I mean, that's what's happening in California, right? I mean, even before this latest fire, the California, I think they call it FAIR. It's the state insurer of last resort for fire. Because tens of thousands of policies were dropped by the commercial insurance companies. So the state had to step in and be the insurer of last resort. So they already had to do that before this latest disaster, which is going to end up costing the state $200 billion. Wow. There's nothing they can do about that except to pass that cost on to the population. Right. So, the insurance system collapses, and the next thing you know, people can't get mortgages, and the domino effect is going to be absolutely devastating. These things are going to start in the most disaster-prone areas, California, Florida, Louisiana, all along the Gulf Coast. But it's going to spread like a cancer, where the insurance system is collapsing everywhere. And the state has to step in to keep complete chaos from occurring. But
Mhm.
the end result has to be that everyone ends up getting a whole lot poorer, because the financial system can no longer, manage to get along the way it always has.
Mhm.
It's crashing to pieces. I think
Mhm.
2025 might be a real watershed year financially.
Yeah.
Um, we've already got a $200 billion natural disaster in the first 2 weeks of the
Right.
year, and yeah, I think the consequences are going to be very far-reaching. Um, it's not going to be good for working people. It's going to be very hard on them. But it also means that the financial system is just flying apart. It's like a rickety old car with stuff just starting to fall off of it. At some point, it's just going to collapse. And it might be this year. We'll see.
You're not the first one that I've heard say that. I've heard other economists talk about this year is could very well be. Again, we don't know for sure, but could the signs are all there.
The
Um,
stressors are just enormous.
that's
They're just enormous stresses. And the mountain of unsatisfiable debt that can never be properly serviced or remitted, is so huge now. I don't know how they're holding it together. Honestly, I don't. I really don't. The world as a whole has got a level of debt that is greater than its own economic output on an annual basis. There's just no way to repay that because the energy isn't there. Right? The economy requires energy to grow, and it can't. And if you can't grow the economy, you can't pay debt. And so
what
it
if
has
we
to.
got the whole world to do like a jubilee? What is it called in the Old Testament? A jubilee, like every 7 years, like all debt was forgiven.
That would be lovely in some ways. It would certainly be a whole lot better for the underdeveloped parts of the world, because they're all have a boot on their neck,
Yeah.
with that sovereign debt that they owe to the West. Um, but it doesn't solve the underlying problem. The underlying problem is we've got 8 billion people and not enough stuff to give them each a life. Um, and that problem isn't going to go away. It's only going to get worse, and it might get worse a whole lot more rapidly than we've seen so far. So, you could have a jubilee where you forgive all the debt, but remember that debt represents people's retirements. It represents their pensions. It represents their health care. It represents their education. It represents companies' ability to do business. So that has meaning, right? And as it gets destroyed, what you're really seeing destroyed is the economy itself. And there's no getting out of it at this point. That's just going to happen. In fact, it is happening. That's why we're all poorer than we used to be, and it's going to get a lot worse.
I willfully make myself poor. Like no, like I seriously, I'm 55. I'm not married. I don't have any kids. I don't own any property. I can fit every material thing in my truck. I live with my mother, rent
Yeah.
free, and it's like fabulous because like you can't like economically like there's nothing you can do to me.
Well, it's like
Like I'm
J.M. said, collapse now and avoid the rush. Get out in
yeah,
front of it.
yeah. There's not a whole lot you could do to my life that way besides killing me or putting me in jail. That can affect me in the negative, which is pretty cool. It's simple. I like simplicity. Anyway, but yeah, I mean, yeah, okay. Um, we'll see what happens this year with 2025 and 2026. Remember the Guy McPherson thing? Remember that?
Yeah.
Yes. With the Arctic like melting and like not coming back. And I think the last show you were on of mine, at the very end of it, you're like, I want to address that because it will come back in the fall, whatever the season is. Have you kept track of any? I don't know what's going down in the Antarctic or Arctic for that matter.
Every now and then I check in on the Arctic. We will get a blue ocean event sometime in the next few years. I don't know
Which
exactly
is
when.
what for the viewers?
Oh, so right. So there's ice. There's an ice cap on the top of the planet, and it gets big in the winter and it shrinks in the summer. Right.
Right.
And it has been a long, long time, like I'm trying to remember, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years since it disappeared entirely in the summer. If it does disappear entirely in the summer, that's called a blue ocean event, and it's a tipping point for the climate, because that's the time of year when the northern part of the planet is pointed toward the sun. And so if there's no ice, all of that sunlight and the heat that goes with it doesn't get reflected off the planet anymore. It gets absorbed by the ocean. So it's a climate tipping point that can tip things over into much more chaotic patterns. We're seeing a lot of those. The blue ocean event is one that will occur. Another big one is the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, what people call the Gulf Stream, or at least that's part of it, which is that water that's warmed on the equator by the sun circulates in those big oceans, and the Atlantic is the one that's called Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, circulates around in a big circle carrying warm water up the coast of North America, the eastern coast of North America, up toward Greenland and then over to Iceland and Western Europe, which is why Western Europe, which has the same latitude as Siberia, has a much nicer climate, right, because of all that warmth coming up. And then when it gets up there, it sinks and comes back along the bottom of the ocean, bringing a lot of nutrients and stuff with it from the poles, and then rises back up. And so you get this circulation. And it's a heat distribution system, because it takes heat from the equators to the north and it brings cold water from the north down to the equator, and it helps equalize the temperature around the planet.
Right.
It doesn't always work that way. Sometimes the circulation suddenly falls short. Instead of going all the way north, it'll start turning around, somewhere around the mid-Atlantic coast. And the water that's further up north just kind of stays there and gets colder and colder and colder. And that's one of the things that can trigger an ice age, right? Because eventually it gets really cold up there and everything freezes. It's much more complicated than that. But in human terms, on human timescales, what it will mean is that Britain no longer looks like Britain. It looks a whole lot more like Greenland, right? Because it's no longer getting all that heat coming up. And the same thing is true for all of Western Europe, which means the 1/3 of a billion people who live there, who already can't manage to feed themselves on what they can grow, are going to be much worse off. And it's very controversial trying to predict when that might happen. But we do know it's been slowing way down. So there's a lot of these tipping points that can occur, and the Blue Ocean event is one of them. So back to Guy McPherson. Yeah, I have been following how that's going up there. And every year, most years, the ice, reaches a new minimum. It's actually in midsummer. It happens around September, and then a maximum around March. And yeah, the McPherson's claim was that when that happens, that will release the green dragon, as it's called, and billions of tons of methane will come up out of the ocean, and suddenly the planet will get 10 or 20 degrees hotter overnight, and we'll all die. I mean, can't rule it out entirely, but I don't think the science generally supports that. Things don't happen that fast. And it would be unprecedented in the Earth record. And most of this stuff has happened before, right? I mean, as I pointed out earlier, the Earth has generally been about 10 degrees centigrade hotter than it is right now.
Right.
And it achieves equilibrium, and life thrives. So, it won't be good for us because it's so abrupt, and it won't be good for most living things right now. But the Earth itself is resilient. It'll be all right. And I don't expect near-term human extinction from global warming in our lifetimes, let's put it that way, or our children's lifetimes, because things just don't happen that quickly. Now, having said that, extinction is always a possibility, just like dying is always a possibility. I can walk out and get hit by a bus in an hour. I can't because there aren't any around here, but I could if I was in a city. And likewise, and things could happen that would cause human extinction in the near term, but that has always been true. That's not a new thing. So it's not something that people should get worked up about.
Yeah, no, I had him on my Green Party show a couple times. I mean, I found him online, and he's classified as a doomer on the YouTube. And these people who I can't remember the other gentleman's name, Reagan something, Patreon or something like that, who was like a McPherson loyalist. And basically, yeah, they just think that within McPherson said by 2026 it's over. Now I haven't seen anything like you're saying, I haven't seen anything to support that claim.
Right, and you got to remember that McPherson was predicting human extinction within 10 years, a lot more than 10 years ago. So, yeah, you can build a kind of a McPherson scenario if you I don't want to attack anyone on this show.
No, no, no,
But
no, no.
but here's
You're
an
nice guy.
example. Here's an example that concerned me. There's something called the aerosol effect.
Correct.
And one of the reasons we're seeing an acceleration is probably down to the aerosol effect. When you burn a lot of stuff and you're not careful about the emissions that creates, one of the things that goes up into the atmosphere is soot and particles and so on. So, for example, the ships that carry stuff all over the planet on the oceans, up until a couple of years ago, were allowed to burn very dirty diesel in very dirty engines, and it put a lot of sulfates up into the atmosphere. And it's known that those sulfates up high in the atmosphere were blocking some of the sunlight and actually had a cooling effect. And when a new rule went into effect a couple of years ago, ships had to stop using that dirty diesel, and they had to very much clean up the kinds of emissions they were producing. And as a consequence, fewer aerosols going up into the air, less sunlight being reflected away, a bump in warming. At the time that rule was coming into effect, there was a study out that said that the aerosol effect might be anywhere from 1 to 11 degrees centigrade. Now, what that meant was that, and I used to teach math, so this is mathy, but statistically speaking, most of the time you can't say with exactitude what's going to happen. Instead, you have to provide a range. You have to provide what's called a confidence interval. It's typically a 95% confidence interval. And what that means is that if all your assumptions are correct and you've done everything by the book, then the correct answer is going to be within the range you give 19 times out of 20.
Right.
And on that 20th time, it'll be outside that range. Right. A lot of assumptions built into that. But you can't say with any confidence whether it's more likely to be in this part of the range or that part of the range. You can't say it's more likely to be in the center. You can't say any of those things. All you can say is this is the range that this study gives us with a 95% confidence interval. And it's just one study among dozens. Mm-hmm. This is most of the time, this is the best science can do, because the world is big and complex and very variable and very chaotic, and it's hard to measure everything. So that's as good as it gets. And what Guy McPherson was doing was telling people that the aerosol effect was 11 degrees centigrade because this study said so.
Oh, gotcha.
That's not what the study said. The study said it's, in fact, I think it was from negative 1.1, but it might have been 1.1 to 11 was the range they gave.
Right.
Right. And it could be anywhere in there. Now it's a couple of years later, and we actually kind of have a pretty good sense of what the aerosol effect was, at least with respect to this rule about sulfur. And it turns out to have been about 1 degree centigrade, give or take.
I see.
Right.
So he's kind of rigging his analysis by taking the most extremes of the statistics.
I don't want to accuse him of anything, but it's very important to have good science literacy.
Oh yeah.
If you're gonna look to claims from studies, from science studies, you need to understand what the nature of those claims is. And unfortunately, very, very few journalists are well trained in this. Right. So, there's plenty of humorous memes about this. A scientist comes up with a highly qualified, very specific conclusion in a study. The university, which wants to, get more students in and get more grant money in, hands it over to their public relations department, who cherry picks out of that study the part they think is going to be most stimulating, publishes that, and then the journalists get hold of that, distort it even further, and pretty soon you've got the public thinking something is a scientific conclusion when in fact it's far, far removed from what the scientists had to say. So yeah, it's good science to be very skeptical of claims. That's all I want to say.
No, that's spot on. I mean, I would think most scientists would say that same thing, that skepticism is a large part of their epistemology. Like these, it's a doubt till you can't doubt anymore. And what's left is probably what's true. Kind of thing. Very Cartesian. Yeah, in the book, again, I was reading today just about that very thing, that there was some scientists that made some claims or came up with a chart. This is a while ago. And then 2 geologists in Canada got suspicious of it. asked for the process and methods applied to come up with this chart, and with some reluctance, they eventually gave it to him. These two geologists gave that data to a statistician, a team of statisticians, and the statisticians were like, "No, you did this wrong. Like, statistical distributions don't work like you think they're working." So, and I guess the claim was by the statisticians is that there's too many scientists who don't really take their information to
That's really true.
statisticians and math. What's that?
That's really true,
Yeah.
especially in the life and earth sciences.
Right. Right.
And I don't want to take anything away from biologists or geologists
No,
or any
no,
other people.
no.
But the fact is that a lot of students go into that thinking that there's not going to be too much math. And honestly, if you haven't mastered statistics, at least up to, a full graduate level, like we're talking, upper division graduate level, you really can't do that science reliably.
Right.
Because the only way we can measure things is in the aggregate. And as soon as you start measuring things in the aggregate, you're doing statistics.
Right.
And when you start making claims on that basis, you have to be very, very careful of the nature of the claims you're making.
Right.
Statistical reasoning is a very specific kind of reasoning, and you've got to know what you're doing. Or you end up making claims that just don't hold up. And it's one of the reasons why there's such a crisis in scientific publishing right now. Something like 50% of scientific conclusions are irreproducible. And that's because the methods that we used to draw the conclusions were faulty. It's kind of bad since we rely on it so much.
Yeah, repeatability and experimentation and so on is like supposed to be an underpinning to the scientific method. And if you're saying 95% of the scientific propositions or conclusions are not of that's somebody's okay. So somebody's snowing us. So okay.
Well, they're snowing themselves.
And they're showing themselves, yeah, for sure.
Very easy to do.
Yeah, for sure. All right, well, that's all extremely interesting, and I could talk about this stuff for a long time because I love this stuff. But I would like to talk more about, like, I want to get your kind of in your perspective on the Ukraine thing, the Putin, because you spoke to that a bit on my last time you were on my show, and I know,
I remember.
Yeah. And you obviously are very concerned, and rightfully you should be, with the Gaza situation. But let's leave that for last because that's going to break my heart. So what about Ukraine? What do you think's going on there currently right now?
Well, Ukraine is hanging on by its fingernails in the hope that the Trump administration is going to abandon them. But it's all kind of farcical in a way because Ukraine is already largely destroyed. I don't mean destroyed by Russia. I mean destroyed as a consequence of the war. They've got a huge demographic crisis. We're now staring at the tragedy of them sacrificing the last demographic they have, which is their youth. Half the population has left the country. Its economy is destroyed. If they send their 18 to 25-year-olds to be cannon fodder, that bodes very poorly for the future of the country. And something that I think is underreported here in the West is that Ukraine already had a demographic problem. If you look at their age distribution, you've seen those graphs where it shows, old people at the top and kids at the bottom, and then it kind of goes like this, depending on how big those cohorts are at any given time. Well, the 18 to 25s in Ukraine are kind of a narrow waist because along with the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a demographic slowdown in all the Slavic countries. Russia was the same way. And consequently, the 18 to 25-year-olds were a very small cohort. So they don't have nearly as many of those as they had of 30 to 50s to draft into the armed forces to begin with. A lot of them have already left the country and are not going to come back unless they're brought back in chains. And the few who are left are needed to keep the lights on. So it's a horrifying situation for Ukraine right now. Absolutely horrifying. And especially when you reflect on what might have been. If the West had not interfered and Ukraine had done what it was set to do, which was to grant the Russian-speaking parts of the country sufficient autonomy so they could speak their own language and practice their own religion and so on and so forth, teach their language in schools, and agreed not to become part of NATO, there'd have been no war.
Right.
And if in March of 2022 we hadn't again interfered along with the UK, the war would have ended with an agreement very much along the same lines: autonomy for the Russian-speaking parts of the country and neutrality for Ukraine. And Ukraine would be more or less okay. I mean, it would still have all the problems it had previously, the most corrupt country in Europe, and serious internal problems, but it wouldn't have been destroyed. And now here we are 2.5 years later. They've lost, probably, it depends on who you talk to, but probably 500,000 dead or seriously injured, at least, and maybe 1 million. Half the population fled the country. Economy absolutely destroyed and in tatters. And they're going to lose the richest parts, economically, the richest parts of the nation. They're going to lose the Donbass, which is where the bulk of the agriculture and most of the mineral extraction is. Which means that their economic base has dramatically shrunk over what it was before the war. And there's nothing anybody can do about it now. And I place that absolutely squarely on the laps of what I consider to be the worst foreign policy administration in the history of the United States. The Biden administration has behaved in ways that just defy any understanding.
Reason.
Just one example. None of them has been willing to talk to the Russian leader or the Russian foreign minister virtually since the war began. And you just don't do that in international relations. I mean, all through the Cold War, in most hot wars, the two sides talk to each other because that's the only way you bring an end to the conflict. And the Biden administration has simply refused to talk. From before the war began, which is pretty much why the war began, even up to the present moment. And one of the things I think got Trump elected is he at least said, I'm going to talk to the guy. Let's work something out.
Right.
It's just as astounding to me. Absolutely astounding.
I mean, it's you hear Democrats criticize him for, call him a traitor for keeping in touch with Putin and stuff like that. And I have no real sympathies for Trump, don't get me wrong. But
maybe it's some kind of adherence to cancel culture or something. Like this is the appropriate way to deal with people that you don't like or disagree with. You just sort of pretend they don't exist. But in the real world, that doesn't work. We're talking about a major power in the world, a nuclear power, with enormous influence in Central Asia. One which we have driven into the arms of China, which is about the dumbest thing you could do if you care about American strategic influence. And we're not going to talk to him because he's bad. I mean, come on, this is childish.
It's definitely childish. Yeah, that's most government is childish. But yeah, okay. Well, all right. Well, we'll see what happens when Mr. Trump gets into office. If he picks up the phone and ends the war on the first day, like everything he's going to do, like his entire presidency is going to happen on the first day.
Keep in mind now that Russia's in the driver's seat. Right? Russia's going to decide when this war ends. We're not going to decide when this war ends. We don't have any way at this point of forcing Russia to a ceasefire. And a ceasefire is not in Russia's interest. Russia is very clear about what is in its interests. It wants the 4 oblasts that elected to become part of Russia, and it wants a neutral Ukraine. And it wants a security structure for Europe that prevents war breaking out again. And those are its terms. I mean, everybody wants peace, but everyone wants peace on their terms. Those are Russia's terms. And Russia right now holds the winning hand. So what's going to happen? Probably Trump is going to figure out a way, probably in conversation with the Russians and others, to declare victory and go home, as we have always done since World War II. We get into a huge mess, whether it's Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan or whatever it might be. And we make this enormous big mess and leave everybody far worse off and countries destroyed. And we declare victory and we go home. So I expect that to happen again.
Right. Okay. Are you keeping up with the BRICS thing?
Well, not in detail, but sure. I know about it.
Indonesia just joined.
I'm sorry?
Indonesia just joined. They're up to 10 members now.
Yeah, Indonesia and Saudi Arabia and Iran and Turkey was going to join, but I don't know how well they're getting along with Russia right at the moment. Russia's very pragmatic, so they'll end up making a deal. Turkey's a very important country. What we're seeing is in kind of slowly in news cycle terms, but kind of rapidly in historical terms, we're seeing the replacement of the United States as the economic hegemon.
Right.
BRICS represents 2/3 of the world's economic output at this point,
Yes.
and they are increasingly trading in currencies other than the dollar.
Mhm.
So the dollar still remains the most important currency in the world, but its position is eroding steadily, along with U.S. influence. And of course, the United States, because of Gaza, has lost the last vestiges of moral authority that it had. And because of its theft of Russia's sovereign funds and its reckless use of sanctions around the world, it has also lost any trust it might have enjoyed. So the United States is no longer liked and no longer trusted. It's pretty clear which way the winds are blowing. It's just a question of how it will play out over time.
Right. Yeah, but it's just nothing to add to the problems going on within in this country, and like you said, America bullied people for way too long, and what happens is when the victims of bullying grow up and get strong enough, they go back for revenge. So I don't know. We'll see what happens.
Well, most world leaders are pragmatic, right? They don't think in terms of grudges and resentments and things of that kind. They're pragmatic. They have a responsibility to their people to make the best decisions possible for the welfare of their own nation. And so they behave accordingly, and that's what we're seeing. And it was really interesting early on in the Ukraine war, after the Russia invaded. Biden called MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, in Saudi Arabia, and MBS didn't take his call, but he took Putin's call. And Saudi Arabia, is still the linchpin of the world economy.
Yeah.
So that tells you pretty clearly which way the winds are blowing.
Yeah. Oh, wow. All right. Well, let's just a little bit of time here left. Talk about the Israeli-Gaza thing. It's hard to talk about. Like I see your posts, and then of course I see others and videos and pictures, disturbing pictures, and it's just I don't even know how to make sense of it. It's awful. I've heard this so many times. I heard again today that supposedly they're on a possible cusp of or approaching a ceasefire negotiation. But I hear that like every week. So I don't know what's going on. What do you know about what's going on?
Hearing from Jeffrey Sachs and from Scott Ritter and from Alistair Crook, the things they've been saying, it sounds as though in the last week that the Biden administration, which is unusual, decided to tolerate some incoming Trump administration involvement in that particular part of American foreign affairs. And a Trump representative, I forget his name, might have been Kellogg, but I'm not sure whether it was him or somebody else, went to those talks between the Israeli representatives and the Palestinian representatives, and in particular spoke to Netanyahu and carried a message from Trump, who had already made a pretty horrifying comment about Hamas. It's like, if this war isn't over, Hamas is going to pay for it. The Palestinians are in huge trouble. We'll make it hell over there, I think was his exact words, which was kind of funny because, how do you turn hell into hell? It's already there. But anyway, this representative basically laid down the law to Netanyahu and said, you will make a ceasefire agreement or we are no longer going to support you. And this was from the incoming Trump people. So, there's really no way of knowing how this is going to unfold at this point. So much damage. Israel has done so much damage to itself. You have to remember that before a year and a half ago, all of the major Arabian leaders were busy normalizing relations with Israel, right? Saudi Arabia was going to normalize relations with Israel. They were all going to be just big old chums. And now none of them will go anywhere near an agreement with Israel. And the Israelis are their own worst enemies because their leaders keep saying such horrifying things and they keep doing such horrifying things. They've become an international pariah and taken us along with them. So in the short run, they're probably just going to keep killing Palestinians and making that place as unlivable as possible because they want it for themselves. But in the medium to long term, Israel might be in serious trouble. Its economy is in tatters after this past year and a half. It relies very heavily on tourism, and it hasn't had any tourists coming for obvious reasons. It has lost any possibility of economic normalization with its immediate neighbors. And internally, it's in political turmoil because the population sees what's going on and recognizes that these right-wingers who've been running the government are running the country into the ground. Something like 100,000 of Israelis have already packed up their bags and left. They've gone home. Those with dual citizenship have said, we've had enough of this. Wow. So in the medium to long term, Israel might be in very serious trouble. There are serious thinkers, people like Ilan Pappé and others, who think that Israel has doomed itself with what it has done recently. But in the meantime, the situation for Palestinians, which was already horrible beyond most people's capacity to imagine, has become many times worse. And you just can't understand how it can happen, but they just keep sending out snipers who shoot 5-year-olds in the head, 40 a day, children being killed. So it's hard to understand. It really is very hard. And it's especially hard to understand how people in the West have been so thoroughly indoctrinated that they have a genocide unfolding right in front of their eyes, and they're just like a deer in the headlights, right? Looking for any rationale they can come up with to somehow mean that they're not the bad guys. But we're the bad guys.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really tough to pay attention to this specific one. But I just said on the same show last night that history is, Israel is just ruined its future. We were talking basically. Well, we started from talking about how there's a whole bunch of countries that won't let Israeli tourists into their countries. Now, most of them are Middle Eastern countries, which that's expected. But Australia is on that list now. They won't let you, if you're a Israeli citizen, you're not allowed to go to the country. Just as a stance against what's going on. That just, I think that speaks to like just the political attitude.
That could all change if there's a ceasefire and things stabilize. People love to not think about what's going on there. So if they're allowed to not think about it, that's cool. I think it's important to think about, if you take a long enough view, you have a handful, a few million settler colonialists living in a part of the world with 1 billion people who don't want them there. The long-term prospects are not good unless they integrate. And integrating means giving up on having a religious state, an ethno-religious state. If they let go of that and integrate into their broader community, then I think in the long term things look really good. Jews and Muslims and Christians have lived in that land for 2,000 years in relative peace.
Right.
So there's no reason it can't happen again.
Right.
But you've got to give up this crazy notion that somehow a rabbinate in the Levant is a going proposition. It's not. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, anything you want to sum it all up with?
Well, I hope we can talk again. I think something we haven't addressed is the perfect storm we're seeing now with respect to collapse. We've touched on some of these things: climate, wars, finances. But there's a whole lot of interrelated stuff going on that
I would, if you want to keep going, I'll keep going. I still want to keep you too long.
Well, I'll just, I looked at a few things, kind of bring my light over here a little bit more. When I was thinking about talking to you, we have the climate situation going on, which is feeding natural disasters. And I was looking at natural disasters over the last 50 years or so. If you go back to 1980, and this is on a government site here. I'm looking at ncei.noaa.gov/access/billion/time series/US/cost. That's a terrible URL. But anyway, I'm looking at something here. It says United States $1 billion disaster events from 1980 to 2024, adjusted for core inflation. And so in constant, in dollars that have been properly adjusted. And from 1980 to 2006, so 26 years, there was only 1 year where the number of events passed 8 and the cost of those events passed $200 billion. And that was in 1998, I think, big hurricane. It has been now 14 years, almost 13 years, since we've had fewer than 8 natural disasters and have them cost less in the aggregate than $200 billion. For the last couple of years, it's been over $500 billion in costs for these natural disasters. So you're looking at a ski jump graph here. And of course, here in 2025, as mentioned, we've already got a $200 billion disaster, and it's, the 14th of January. So that has enormous implications because we can't afford it. And so how are those costs going to get paid? The insurance companies they simply can't do it because they can't make any money doing it. They can't remain solvent. And if they can't remain solvent, then the reinsurers, who are big multinationals, insurance companies have to get insurance to cover their insurance. They can't do it, which means the only way people can get any recompense for the damage they've suffered from these disasters, their homes that have burned down or washed away or blown away or destroyed by tornadoes or what have you, is for the government to do it. But the government can only do it by either printing currency to do it with, which is inflationary, and has its own negative consequences for the financial system, or raising taxes, which it's really not in a position to do because people can't afford to pay them, or raising its own insurance rates to the point that most people can't pay. And that's what's actually happening, which means that people can't buy insurance for their homes in many of these very densely populated parts of the world, in Los Angeles, in big parts of it, in Florida, in big parts of it, in other parts of the country, where the natural disasters are simply outpacing the ability of the financial system to compensate. They have to raise the insurance rates to the point where people can't buy insurance. And the problem with that is if you can't buy insurance, you can't get a mortgage. And if you can't get a mortgage, for 99 people out of 100, you can't get a house. And so in this way, the cost of those disasters ultimately is going to fall on ordinary people who are going to be much, much poorer and have much, much worse prospects than they have ever had in living memory in this country. You have to go back to the Great Depression. And even then, it's probably going to get worse than that. And that's just from the natural disasters alone. That's apart from everything else. The consequences for the financial system as a whole, of course, is that if people can't buy mortgages, then the financial system doesn't have something to invest in to keep growing its business. And the thing about capitalism is if it can't grow, it collapses. I've often seen the analogy of a souffle, right? As long as that souffle is puffing up like this, it's fine. The minute it stops puffing, what happens? It falls, right? And that's how a capitalist financial system works. Well, we've pretty much reached the limits of the puffing at this point. As I said, the amount of debt, public and private, is so enormous. There is literally no way it can ever be satisfied. There are only 2 things that can happen to it. Well, 3 things. It could all be forgiven, but I've already explained you really can't do that because, one person's debt is another person's investment.
Right.
And wiping out all those assets. So the other options are default, which also wipes out all the assets, or inflation, and which is a real risk of hyperinflation at some point. That also wipes out the assets, but it does it a little more slowly.
Right.
The end result is that a lot of nominal wealth will just vanish. People complain a lot about Bezos and Musk and these people getting so much richer over the last 20 years. Well, that's the puff in the souffle, right? All that money is nominal. It doesn't actually correspond to any actual real world wealth. It corresponds to a certain amount of power, which is what makes those guys so irritating. But all of that asset wealth is just gonna vanish like mist in the sunlight. And that has consequences for ordinary people because the system itself is necessary in order for people to get fed, to get housed, to get medical care. And as the system starts to break apart, in that period between it's falling all apart and it's being put back together into some kind of working system, in that period in between, a lot of people suffer very, very much, very badly. And we could see, I was thinking about this the other day, when this crisis hits, we could see, it could be epic. It could be, government work programs to avoid revolution, bread lines, in fact, we're already seeing internal migration starting to grow, and it could turn into mass internal migration. I mean, what happens when nobody in Miami can get insurance anymore? And that could happen, just one more big hurricane. All of a sudden, they can live in Miami Beach. What's going to happen to California? You got 20 million people living in Los Angeles, and they can't buy a house any longer. What are they going to do? They're going to pick up sticks and move. It's going to be like the Great Depression in reverse. Instead of the Okies coming to California, it's going to be all those those Angelinos going someplace else, and just enormous disruptions. So I think we're starting to see, and this year could really be epic. I think we're starting to see some of the major elements of civilizational collapse starting to really unfold in real time as we watch. So it's going to be super interesting. It's going to be very painful, already is. And people really need to cultivate resilience in every way they possibly can, because there's just no knowing how it's going to unfold.
Yeah, that's why I would recommend people watch go on YouTube and look up How to Enjoy the End of the World by Sid Smith. Because however it happens and when it happens or how intensely it happens, you should always stay happy.
You're right. And the government's all about that, right? They're always about emergency preparedness. Now's the time. I mean, simple things you can do. To the extent you possibly can, keep a wad of cash on hand, because one of the consequences of a severe jolt is that the banking system freezes. And when that happens, you can't go to the grocery store and use your credit card or your debit card anymore, right?
Oh, okay.
All transactions will be cash. It probably would only last a few days, maybe a few weeks, but it could easily happen. So don't be left without. Keep several months worth of dry goods on hand. Keep water on hand, especially if you live places where you get municipal water. It's not hard to get those big plastic core boys of water at the big box stores, right? Gather a half dozen of those and keep them full in the basement. Know what to do when have a bug out bag. Know what when there's a disaster, when an emergency is declared. Above all, know all your neighbors and be a good neighbor to them. So, because individuals are very fragile, communities are much more resilient.
Sure.
Nurture strength of spirit. Remember that crises are the norm in human existence, not the exception. Right. So it's going to be okay. Right? You still get to live your life. You still get to live your life, even as civilization collapses around you.
Must be like a bumper sticker or something. Well, very cool. All right, Sid Smith, thank you so much for coming on Let's Talk Lake County. Always a great pleasure talking to you. Always fascinating and interesting stuff here, even if a little macabre. But it's important stuff for sure. So yeah, no, I'm gonna keep asking to come on, and we can further the discussion. There's plenty more. There's no end to topics to talk about. That's for sure. Especially. Good, as do I. And especially 2025, as we get into it and after next week, after the inauguration, I don't know. We'll see. We'll see how it goes. I'm hoping it'll be more of a comedy show than like an actual disaster.
Disaster can be funny. I like dark humor.
Slapstick. Slapstick is like a genre of comedy. Slapstick. If people getting hurt, we laugh.
The joke, they say dark humor is like food. Not everybody gets it.
Oh, wow. That's the dark humor, I see. It's self-referential almost. Okay, cool.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for tuning in, everybody, to Let's Talk Lake County. I'll talk to you next time. Okay, bye-bye. Sid, if you could hang on 1 second.
Absolutely.